The night I first saw the East River wasn't about the water, it was about what floated on it, power, and the bodies it carried. The fog sat low over the East River that night, like it was hiding secrets even the city wasn't ready to give up. I was 11 years old, fresh off the boat from Sicily, and my shoes were already falling apart. The soles flapped with every step, slapping against the wet cobblestone like a cheap drum. The smell of the docks was a punch in the nose: salt water, fish guts, coal smoke, and something else, something like danger, if danger had a smell. We had come here chasing the American dream. My mother said it would be a new beginning. My father, well, he never made it off the ship. Pneumonia took him somewhere between Palermo and New York, and by the time they dropped anchor, it was just me, my mother, and the kind of hunger that makes a boy older than he should be. The Lower East Side in 1906 wasn't the America from the postcards. It was a mess of narrow streets jammed with pushcarts and shouting in a dozen different tongues: Italian, Yiddish, Irish, Polish. Every corner was a fight for space, and every alley smelled like yesterday's garbage. The tenement buildings rose up on either side like dark, crooked teeth, and the windows looked down at you the way an old landlord does when the rent's late. I remember looking up the street that night and seeing him, the first man I ever thought of as important. He stepped out of a shiny black Packard like it was his throne, wearing a dark overcoat that caught the light from the street lamp just so. His hat was tilted forward, shadowing his eyes, but you could feel them on you, weighing and measuring. Two other men trailed behind him, their hands buried deep in their pockets, but you could tell they weren't just keeping warm. That was the moment I understood something. Power wasn't just about who shouted the loudest or who threw the first punch. It was about presence. That man didn't have to say a word, the street moved around him like it knew better than to get in his way. The next day, I asked an older boy, Tony, who sold newspapers down by Hester Street, who that man was. Tony just gave me a look like I was already asking for trouble. "That's Frankie Costello's cousin," he said. "You don't ask about him unless you want to end up in the river." And then he went back to folding papers like he hadn't just told me I'd brushed shoulders with a ghost. You see, back then the East River was more than just water separating Manhattan from Brooklyn. It was a graveyard with a current. If the tide was right, it carried secrets away. If it wasn't, it brought them back to shore, bloated and staring at the sky. Even as a kid, I knew that was the kind of place where fortunes were made and lives ended in the same night. We lived in a fifth-floor walk-up on Orchard Street, one room for the two of us. The wallpaper was peeling, the floorboards groaned with every step, and the rats didn't even bother to run when you came in. But I didn't care. At night I'd lie awake and listen to the street, horses' hooves clopping, men shouting in Italian, the creak of wagons rolling over the stones, and I'd picture myself in that Packard, the world stepping aside as I passed. There's a funny thing about dreams in neighborhoods like mine. They're not about being rich, not at first. They're about not being scared. Every man I knew worked himself to the bone just to survive another week, and every one of them was scared of the landlord, of the cops, of the other gangs. But that man I saw on the street? He wasn't scared of anybody. The first time I met Meyer Lansky, it was in that same neighborhood. We were both kids, maybe 12, running from the same group of Irish boys who thought it was fun to rough up the smaller ones. We ducked into an alley, panting, and Meyer looked at me with those sharp eyes of his. "You're fast," he said. "But you're not smart. You ran the wrong way." I laughed, and from that day, Meyer wasn't just a friend, he was the first man who made me think we could actually win in this city. Still, that night by the river never left me. Every time I walked past those docks, I'd slow down, listening for the sound of that Packard's engine, watching for a shadow that matched the man I'd seen. In my head I imagined him noticing me one day, calling me over and asking if I wanted to learn how the world really worked. Of course, the truth is, nobody calls you over in this life. You make them notice you. And if they don't, you make them have to. Years later, I'd think back to that first winter in New York and realize it wasn't luck that brought me here, it was survival. The East River didn't just divide the city, it was a mirror. On one side, you had the dreamers, the ones who thought America was a gold mine just waiting to be dug. On the other, you had the men who knew better, the ones who took the gold right out of other men's hands. That night, as the fog thickened and the lights of Brooklyn blinked across the water, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't just survive in this city, I'd own a piece of it. And maybe, if I played my cards right, I'd own enough that one day I wouldn't have to flinch every time someone said a name like Frankie Costello. Because in New York, the river remembers. And if you want to stay afloat, you'd better learn to swim with the sharks before they decide your dinner. In my neighborhood, the sidewalk was the throne, and the one who ruled it didn't wear a crown, he carried a knife. If the East River was the city's bloodstream, the sidewalks were its pulse. Every morning on Orchard Street, the pushcarts rolled out like soldiers in formation, fruit piled high, bolts of cloth stacked like bricks, the smell of hot knishes and frying onions hanging in the cold air. You could tell who was doing well by the size of the smile on the vendor's face, and who was in trouble by how often they looked over their shoulder. I was 13 when I learned that the sidewalk wasn't just where you walked, it was where you earned your place in the world. The Irish had their corners, the Jews had theirs, and us Sicilians? We fought for the scraps in between. It wasn't official, but it was law all the same. That's where I started my first business. Not the kind you put in the paper, no, this was a protection service. For a nickel a week, I made sure the younger kids could get home without getting their pockets turned inside out by the bigger boys. I didn't call it extortion. I called it insurance. My first customers were two Italian twins who sold roasted chestnuts. They couldn't fight worth a damn, and every week some older punk would knock over their cart. I told them I could make that stop. Of course, to make that promise stick, I needed muscle. That's when I started running with Meyer Lansky. I met Meyer again, this time not running from anybody. He was standing outside a pool hall, arms crossed, watching a couple of older boys play. His eyes didn't blink much, they just calculated. I walked up, told him about the Chestnut twins and my plan. He didn't say yes right away. He just asked, "What's my cut?" From that day, it was me and Meyer. He had the brains for the money, I had the nerve for the street. He'd figure out how to make it all look fair, and I'd make sure it stayed that way. We kept our word, and word travels fast in a neighborhood where trust is rarer than fresh bread. One night we were leaning against a lamppost, splitting a loaf of day-old bread, when a group of Irish boys came swaggering down the block. The leader, a thick-necked kid named Danny O'Shea, looked at us like we were in his way. "This is our street tonight," he said. I didn't move. I just took another bite of bread. "It's our street every night," I told him. The next few seconds were a blur of fists, shouts, the crack of someone's head against the brick wall. Meyer wasn't big, but he was quick, and I'd learned a few things about ending a fight fast. We walked away bruised, but we walked away. The next morning, Danny O'Shea's crew kept their distance. Sometimes you win respect with words. Most times, you win it with the way you look a man in the eye after you've put him on the ground. That fight didn't just keep our little operation alive, it expanded it. More kids came to us for insurance. Even some older vendors started slipping me coins when they saw trouble brewing. It wasn't about the money yet. It was about building something that belonged to us. But here's the thing, the bigger your kingdom, the more people want to take it from you. It wasn't long before the real gangs noticed us. They didn't care about chestnut vendors. They cared about the idea that a couple of teenagers were making money without paying tribute. One cold January night, I got a visit from a man named Frankie Vento. He wasn't old, maybe 25, but to us, he might as well have been a made man in the Roman Senate. He wore a sharp coat and had a cigarette dangling from his lips like it was part of his face. "You the kid they call Lucky?" he asked. "That's me," I said, though truth be told I hadn't heard the nickname much yet. He flicked his cigarette into the snow. "From now on, you work for us. Half your take every week. Or you don't work at all." I didn't argue. You don't argue with a man like Frankie Vento on a dark street when you're 13. But walking home, I felt something burning hotter than the winter wind in my chest. It wasn't fear. It was ambition. If a man like Frankie could own half a dozen streets, why couldn't I own the whole damn map? Meyer and I paid Vento for a while. But we also started watching him, how he walked, how he talked, who he smiled at and who he didn't. Because if the sidewalk was a throne, you didn't just sit on it. You learned how to build it higher. Those days taught me more than any school could. They taught me how to make a man feel safe enough to hand you his last nickel, and how to make another man too scared to take it away. Looking back, I see it now, we weren't just playing at being tough kids. We were learning the rules of the only game that mattered in New York. The kind where there are no referees, no timeouts, and the final score is written in the newspaper when someone doesn't wake up the next morning. And every day, the sidewalks whispered the same thing: keep moving, kid. Or someone's gonna take your place. You don't plan your first knife fight. It plans you. Some nights on the Lower East Side had a way of feeling heavier than others, like the air was watching you. It was late summer, the kind where the humidity stuck to your skin and the street lamps hummed low, like they were tired too. I was 15, walking home after counting out coins with Meyer in the back of a candy shop we used as our office. That's when I saw them. 3 shadows breaking off from the wall ahead, spreading out like they were taking positions on a chessboard. I recognized 2 of them Irish boys from down near the docks. The third was a new face, tall, wearing a cap pulled low. "You lucky?" the tall one asked, stepping closer. I didn't answer right away. My hand tightened around the handle of the little folding knife in my pocket. "Depends who's asking," I said. He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Danny O'Shea says hello." The first punch came before I could blink. My head snapped back and my vision went white for a second. Instinct took over. I swung my knife up, catching the nearest one in the arm. He howled, stumbled back, but the other 2 didn't give me room to breathe. A knee caught me in the gut. Fists pounded against my shoulders, my ribs. I felt a sharp sting in my side, a blade. My mind didn't even register fear, just calculation. If I go down here, I'm not getting back up. I don't remember every move I made, but I remember the noise, the grunts, the scrape of shoes on stone, the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I fought like a cornered dog, not because I wanted to win, but because I refused to lose. At some point, they ran. I don't know if it was because they thought I'd had enough or because they realized I was ready to keep going until one of us didn't walk away. I was left in the street, my shirt wet with blood, the knife still in my hand. That's when I heard footsteps. For a second I thought they were coming back, but it was Meyer, his face pale under the street lamp. "Jesus, Lucky," he muttered, kneeling beside me. "You're bleeding all over the sidewalk." "Still breathing," I said, my voice shaky. "So I guess I'm lucky." The name stuck. Word spread faster than the blood dried. The next morning, kids who wouldn't give me a second glance before now stepped aside when I walked past. Vendors nodded, some with respect, some with pity. And somewhere in that tangled mix of reactions was the thing I'd been chasing since the day I saw that man in the Packard: recognition. But here's the truth nobody tells you: violence changes you, even when you win. I couldn't shake the smell of iron from my nose, the way the street looked darker after the fight, like it had swallowed part of me. A week later, Frankie Vento called me over. I figured he was going to give me grief about bringing trouble to his turf, but instead he grinned. "Heard you didn't go down easy," he said. "That's good. That's how you last in this town." It wasn't a compliment, it was an invitation. Men like Vento didn't waste time on kids unless they saw something they could use. That night, I realized something important: surviving violence was only half the trick. The other half was making sure it worked for you. From then on, Meyer and I moved differently. We didn't just protect carts and kids anymore, we started controlling who got to sell where. We kept the peace, but only the peace we approved of. And the people who didn't like it? they either paid extra or they packed up their pushcarts. That brought in more money, but it also brought more heat. Rival crews started sniffing around, seeing if we'd make easy targets. But the fight had given me a reputation, and reputations in our world are like loaded dice, you just have to make sure they land the way you want. One night, a small-time bookie named Angelo came to me with a problem. Another gang had started leaning on him for a bigger cut of his profits. He didn't want to pay, but he didn't want to get killed either. "What'll it cost me?" he asked. "Cheaper than your funeral," I told him. We handled it quietly, no blades, no bodies. Just a talk in a back alley, Meyer counting out what Angelo owed us while I stood there, arms crossed, letting silence do the work. Sometimes the absence of violence is more dangerous than the act itself. Looking back, that was the moment we crossed the line from surviving to building. You can't run a sidewalk kingdom forever, eventually you have to move up. And moving up means learning how to fight with your head as much as your hands. But I also knew something else, the street never forgets. The knife fight, the blood, it was a warning, a reminder that no matter how high you climb, there's always someone watching, waiting for the night you turn down the wrong block. That fight didn't make me fearless. It made me careful. And careful men live longer. If you want to be king, you first serve the devil who owns the crown. They say every man in this life starts as somebody else's soldier, even the kings, even the ones who end up writing the rules. My turn came in the form of Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria, a man who didn't just run rackets, he ran the air you breathed if you wanted to make $1 without breaking your skull. I met Masuria the way most street kids met their first real boss, by accident. I was hanging around outside a pool hall on East Broadway waiting for Meyer when a black Hudson pulled up. Out stepped a big man in a double-breasted suit, shoulders like a bear, fingers heavy with gold rings. His walk was slow, deliberate, like the street belonged to him and the rest of us were just visiting. He stopped, lit a cigar, and let the smoke curl around his face before speaking. "You Luciano?" he asked. I nodded, careful. He smiled, not a warm smile, more like a man testing a blade to see if it's sharp. "I heard you're a kid who doesn't scare easy. I can use kids like that." First lessons working for Masuria wasn't like running the sidewalks with Meyer. This was the major leagues: bootlegging, gambling, extortion, loan sharking. The kind of work where the numbers weren't nickels anymore, they were thousands. The kind where mistakes weren't just costly, they were fatal. At first, my job was simple errands. I'd deliver envelopes, pick up packages, and relay messages. But it wasn't the tasks that mattered, it was the exposure. Every trip was a lesson in how the machine worked. I learned quickly that prohibition had turned the city into a gold mine for men like Masuria. You couldn't buy a legal drink, but if you knew the right door to knock on, you could have champagne and whiskey flowing until dawn. And Masuria owned a lot of those doors. One night, I was sent to a speakeasy in Midtown to deliver a package. The place was dressed like a bakery up front, but through a side door you stepped into a red velvet paradise: music, smoke, and enough liquor to drown a priest. I saw the way men greeted Masuria when he arrived, half respect, half fear. That's when I understood, in this business, your real currency isn't money. It's presence. Old world versus New World. Masuria was old-school Sicilian. He believed in omerta, the code of silence, and in keeping the power within the old families. But the streets were changing. Immigrants from all over, Jews, Irish, Italians who didn't care for the old ways, were building their own empires. This was where Meyer's influence on me became gold. I wasn't just an Italian kid anymore. I had a foot in two worlds. Meyer had taught me how to deal with outsiders without treating them like outsiders. That made me valuable to Masuria, even if he didn't say it out loud. Still, there were rules. And one of the first was loyalty, at least as far as appearances went. You didn't question orders and you didn't act like you were smarter than the boss, even if you were already thinking 2 moves ahead. Blood in the ledger. One night, Masuria called me into the back room of a restaurant he owned on Mulberry Street. The place smelled like garlic and tomato sauce, but behind the kitchen door the air turned cold. "There's a guy," he said, "been playing cards in my clubs, losing more than he can pay. I need you to go remind him of his debt." I knew what remind meant. It wasn't about collecting the money, it was about collecting respect. I found the guy, a wiry gambler named Sal, in a dingy room over a pawnshop. I didn't have to hurt him much. Just enough so he'd remember who he owed. But walking back that night, I felt it, the shift. I was no longer the kid who fought for street corners. I was an enforcer now, even if my title didn't say it. The boss's table. As the months rolled by, I earned a seat, if not at the big table, then at one close enough to hear the whispers. Deals were made over plates of pasta, territories divided over glasses of Chianti. I learned that the real power moves weren't shouted in alleys, they were spoken softly over dinner, so softly you had to lean in to catch them. Masuria didn't trust easily, but he trusted what he could use. I was useful because I didn't just bring him messages, I brought him information: which rival was expanding, which cop was looking for a bribe, which speakeasy had the best whiskey coming in from Canada. Patience in the shadows. If I had to pick the most important thing I learned from Masuria, it wasn't how to make money or how to survive a police raid, it was patience. In the streets, you win quick or you lose quick. But in this game, you play the long hand. I remember sitting with him one night, watching two crews negotiate over a piece of territory. The younger guys were hot, ready to draw guns. Masuria just puffed on his cigar, smiling faintly. "Let them think they're winning," he told me quietly. "The man who keeps his temper keeps his kingdom." I didn't know it then, but those words would stay with me for the rest of my life. For shadow of betrayal, the longer I worked for him, the more I noticed the cracks. Masuria was powerful, but he was stubborn. He didn't see the future coming, not the way I did. The city was changing, and the old guard's refusal to adapt was painting targets on their backs. In whispered conversations with Meyer, we talked about a new kind of organization, one that worked with every nationality if they brought value, one that ran like a business instead of a feudal kingdom. It wasn't betrayal, not yet. It was vision. But visions like that? They can get you killed if you share them with the wrong ears. So I kept mine to myself, biding my time, learning every corner of the business, every weakness in the structure. Looking back, that period under Joe Masuria was my schooling. Not the kind you get in books, but the kind you get in the back of a car at midnight or over a whispered order in a noisy club. I was learning to be more than a soldier. I was learning to be a boss. And a boss knows when to play the loyal apprentice and when to start sharpening the knife. Prohibition wasn't a law, it was an invitation. The day they made liquor illegal in this country, half the city cried, and the other half started counting money they didn't even have yet. For men like Joe Masuria, it was a gift. For me, it was a door swinging wide open. See, you can't outlaw desire. You can slap it with fines, you can put it in handcuffs, but people will still want what they want. And when the government turned off the tap, it didn't dry up the thirst, it just made it more expensive. We ran whiskey like it was oxygen. Canadian rye, scotch from the old country, rum from the islands, we brought it in by the truckload, the boatload, sometimes straight through the front door of places that were supposed to be dry. Speakeasies popped up like weeds. One week a building was a tailor shop, the next, it had a secret backroom with jazz playing and women in silk dresses laughing over champagne. The expansion, my job changed overnight. No more small errands or occasional debt collections. Now I was in charge of coordinating shipments, making sure they left Montreal, slipped past the Coast Guard, and ended up in the right cellars in Manhattan. It was logistics, but in this line of work, logistics meant keeping everyone from the cops to rival gangs from sinking your operation. We had trucks with false panels, fishing boats with hidden compartments, and delivery men who carried crates marked pickles that sloshed a little too much to be brine. Meyer handled the books, quiet, precise, making sure every bottle was accounted for. I made sure no one tried to take them before they got to the clubs. The clubs, there's a smell I'll never forget: cigarette smoke, perfume, and whiskey. It was the smell of money. I'd walk into one of our clubs and the room would seem to breathe with it. The band would be swinging, the girls would be laughing, and at every table there'd be a man with a glass in his hand pretending he wasn't breaking the law. One night I brought a new shipment to a place we called the Velvet Room. Inside, the lights were low, the bar polished like a mirror, and the sound of glasses clinking was like music to me. But the real music was in the back office where we counted the night's take. We were making more in a week than I used to see in a year on the sidewalks. And every dollar came with the same price tag, keeping it. Blood in the business. Prohibition didn't just make fortunes, it made enemies. The Irish crews had their own routes, the Jewish outfits theirs, and the Sicilians, well, we thought we could run it all. That belief got people killed. One evening we lost an entire truck to hijackers on the Brooklyn side. The driver was left in the street, his head split open, the whiskey gone. I knew the crew that did it, they were small-time but hungry. And hungry men are dangerous. Masuria's answer was simple: send a message. We found their leader in a card game 2 nights later. I didn't pull the trigger, I didn't have to. Just being there, standing in the doorway with my hands in my coat pockets, was enough to make the room go silent. The shot came from one of our older guys, clean and quick. The point wasn't the kill, it was the silence that followed, the knowledge that stealing from us was worse than stealing from the devil himself. Public enemies in private. The papers started calling bootleggers public enemies, like we were all the same. But in private, half the city's cops, judges, and politicians were drinking our liquor. I'd shake hands with a man in City Hall during the day, then see him in a speakeasy at night, his tie loosened, laughing too loud. We paid for that privilege, of course. Envelopes stuffed with cash went to the right hands. And the ones that couldn't be bought? We found other ways to make them cooperative. The tension under the glamour from the outside, it was all velvet curtains and crystal glasses. On the inside, it was tension you could cut with a knife. Every deal had to be airtight, every shipment timed down to the hour, because one slip could mean a raid or a robbery, or worse, both in the same night. I slept less. Ate less. The money was good, but the stakes were higher than they'd ever been. And the higher you climb, the thinner the air gets. The first cracks. It was during this time that I started to notice the old man's blind spots. Masuria was good at ruling with fear, but he didn't see the storm coming. The new generation, guys like me, Meyer, Bugsy, we weren't content with just holding territory. We wanted to organize it, expand it, make it run like a machine. But machines need oil, and the old ways were rust. Looking back, the whiskey and the smoke made it all look prettier than it was. But underneath, the blood was already seeping in. Prohibition didn't just build empires, it set the stage for wars. And whether I knew it or not, I was already being groomed to fight one. I always thought death would come fast, but that night it came with a blindfold. The night started like any other, quiet, with just enough whiskey in my veins to make the city lights blur a little. I'd been at one of our midtown clubs, the Silver Swan, talking business with a couple of out-of-town contacts. The band was soft, the air heavy with cigarette smoke and perfume. Nothing about the evening hinted that I was about to come face to face with the edge of my own grave. When I stepped outside, the air had that early spring chill, the kind that smells like rain before it falls. I lit a cigarette, leaned against the curb, and waved off a cab. That's when the black sedan rolled up. It stopped just short of my shoes. The rear door swung open. I barely had time to register the movement before 2 men grabbed me, one from each side, slamming me into the back seat. A third man slid in after me, pressing cold steel against my ribs. "Don't talk," he said. "Don't move." The door shut. The city disappeared. The car moved fast, weaving through the streets with no headlights. I tried to track the turns in my head east, then north, but the longer it went, the more disoriented I felt. The only sounds were the tires on wet asphalt and the faint creak of leather seats. They tied a blindfold around my eyes, and the world went black. Funny thing about losing your sight in a moment like that, it doesn't make you less aware, it makes you more. I could smell the driver's cheap cologne, hear the faint wheeze in the breathing of the man to my left. My fingers flexed against the rope around my wrists. I thought about running. Then I thought about dying. Then I thought about nothing at all, because sometimes that's the only way to keep from panicking. The beating when the car stopped, they dragged me out. My shoes hit gravel, then dirt. The night air smelled of salt close to water. They didn't waste time. The first punch landed in my stomach, knocking the wind clean out of me. Another caught my jaw. I hit the ground, the blindfold still tight. Boots found my ribs, my back, my legs. Someone said, "That's enough." Then a blade slid into my side, quick, sharp, businesslike. I gasped, the pain blooming hot and cold all at once. "You tell your boss," one of them said, "this is what happens when he steps in the wrong territory." Another voice, calm, almost friendly, added, "Lucky you're still breathing." Left for dead, they threw me down hard, my face hitting wet sand. A moment later I heard the car door slam, the engine start, and the tires spin away. I lay there, feeling the tide creep in toward my legs. My blood was mixing with the salt water. I thought, this is it. But dying isn't like in the movies. It doesn't happen in one grand, dramatic sweep. It's slow. It's cold. And it gives you time to think, too much time. I thought about my mother, about Meyer, about all the nights I'd promised myself I'd own this city. And I thought, if I'm still alive when the sun comes up, I'm not stopping until I do. The rescue. I don't know how long I lay there. Minutes? Hours? It felt like days. Then I heard footsteps crunching on the sand. "Jesus Christ," a voice said. "It's Luciano." 2 dock workers found me, hauled me up, and got me to a doctor who knew better than to ask questions. I was stitched, patched, and told to rest. Rest wasn't on my mind. Revenge was. The aftermath. The news traveled faster than I could heal. In our world, getting beaten and stabbed could go 2 ways. It could make you look weak or it could make you look untouchable. The fact that I survived, that I walked back into the street a week later, earned me a reputation I hadn't even planned for. The whispers started, "That's lucky Luciano. You can't kill him." The change in me but survival came with a shift. Before the kidnapping, I'd been ambitious, sure, but I'd also been willing to play the old game, follow the old rules. After that night, something burned cleaner in me. I saw clearly that the old ways weren't built to last. They were too personal, too tied to vendettas and pride. If I was going to take this city, I wasn't going to do it with just Sicilians or just Italians. I was going to do it with the best, no matter where they came from, Jews, Irish, anyone who could make money and keep quiet. The kidnapping wasn't just an attack. It was an education. The quiet resolve. Meyer visited me while I was still laid up. He didn't ask who did it, he knew I wouldn't say until I was ready. Instead, he leaned in, his voice low. "Next time they come for you," he said, "you'll have an army waiting." I smiled, wincing at the pain in my jaw. "Next time," I told him, "I'll make sure there's no them left." Looking back, I realized that night on the beach was the hinge my whole life swung on. Before it, I was a rising street lieutenant in somebody else's game. After it, I was a man building his own. And in this city, the only thing more dangerous than a man who can't be killed is a man who knows exactly what he's going to do with the time he's got left. The old way was war. The new way was business. If the kidnapping left me with scars, it also left me with clarity. I'd been watching the old guard long enough to see the cracks. Joe Masuria might have been the boss of bosses, but he was stuck in the past, clinging to Sicilian pride like it was a shield against the future. The truth? That shield had holes. And through those holes, men like me were looking. The war nobody wanted. The Castellamarese War had been chewing up the streets for months. 2 Sicilian factions, Masuria on one side, Salvatore Maranzano on the other, both too proud to back down. Every week another headline, a shooting in Little Italy, a body in Brooklyn, another family in mourning. Business was bleeding, and for what? So two old men could argue about who got to sit at the head of the table? I wasn't the only one who saw it. Meyer saw it. Bugsy saw it. Even some of the older guys whispered about how the constant bloodshed was bad for business. But whispers don't end wars. Actions do. The betrayal Masuria trusted me enough to think I'd follow him into the grave. But loyalty in this life isn't about who you started with, it's about who can take you further. And Maranzano had a vision closer to mine, a more organized, business-like mafia, open to alliances with non-Italians if it meant profit. It was a choice between a boss who treated the streets like a chessboard and one who thought he was still playing with rocks in the old country. The meeting was set at a Coney Island restaurant. Masuria loved cards, so we made it look like just another game between friends. I sat across from him, the smell of fried clams in the air, my hands steady on the table. We played. We laughed. And when I excused myself to the bathroom, 4 men I'd arranged were already moving in. By the time I came back, the game was over. The new boss with Masuria gone, Maranzano crowned himself boss of bosses. He reorganized the mafia into 5 families, each with its own boss, underboss, and capos. It was cleaner, smarter, no more free-for-all chaos. I got my own family, the Luciano family. The name meant something now. It meant respect, and it meant control. The blueprint. Here's the thing, Maranzano thought he was the architect of the new mafia. In truth, he was just finishing the first draft. My draft was different. I saw the mafia as a corporation. Every territory was a department. Every racket was a revenue stream. And just like in business, partnerships mattered more than bloodlines. I brought Meyer in for the financial brains, Bugsy for muscle and fearlessness, and a few other key players who understood that money doesn't care about your accent. The old ways had one fatal flaw: they made enemies out of men who could have been allies. I wasn't going to repeat that mistake. The short reign of Maranzano liked to think he'd tamed the beast. But power makes some men cautious and others paranoid. He started talking about cleaning house, getting rid of the young Turks, me, Bugsy, Meyer, before we got too ambitious. That was his mistake. I learned something from Masuria's fall: if you see the knife coming, you don't wait to get cut. I arranged for Maranzano to be taken out in his office. No drama, no public spectacle, just a quick, surgical removal. And with him gone, there was no boss of bosses anymore. We were equals on paper. In reality, everyone knew who had the biggest piece of the pie. The birth of the commission. Instead of a single ruler, I set up the commission, a governing body of the 5 family bosses, plus key allies from other ethnic groups. It was part peacekeeping council, part corporate boardroom. Disputes got settled at the table, not in the street. Territory was negotiated, not stolen in the night. Did it stop all the bloodshed? No. But it cut it down. And in this business, fewer bodies meant more business. Respect in the open for the first time. I wasn't just a name whispered in backrooms. I was meeting openly with politicians, union leaders, even businessmen who wouldn't admit to knowing me in public but still found their way to my office when they needed something done. I wasn't chasing corners anymore, I was shaping the map. The shift the streets noticed. So did the cops. And so did the newspapers. The name Lucky Luciano started showing up in print more often, usually with words like racketeer or crime czar attached. But here's the difference between me and the bosses who came before: I wasn't trying to be untouchable. I was trying to be indispensable. You can run from the law forever, or you can make the law work around you. Looking back, the day the 5 families were born wasn't the end of an old war, it was the start of a new era. And in that era, I wasn't just surviving, I was building something that could last, at least until the next storm rolled in. Because in this life, you're only ever one meeting away from your last meal. Your friends can keep you alive, but your enemies teach you how. Power in this city isn't a straight climb, it's a balancing act on a tightrope stretched between two rooftops, one side lined with friends, the other with men waiting for you to fall. And the wind never stops blowing. After Maranzano was gone, my world felt wider. I had room to breathe, room to move. The commission kept the families from tearing each other apart for a while, and that gave me time to cement the alliances that would define my reign. The inner circle. Meyer Lansky was more than a partner. He was the accountant of the underworld, the man who could turn dirty money clean without leaving a fingerprint. Where I saw opportunity, he saw numbers, and numbers in our line of work were bullets you could fire without making noise. Then there was Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, fast hands, fast temper, and a face that could charm you right before it scared you. Bugsy wasn't just muscle, he was ambition wrapped in a tailored suit. If Meyer was the brain, Bugsy was the sharp edge. Together, we weren't just running rackets, we were building an empire that could pivot, adapt, and outthink anyone who came for us. Dealing across lines, the old guard hated what I was doing. They wanted Sicilian purity, old country codes. I wanted efficiency. That meant dealing with the Jewish mobs, the Irish gangs, even the black policy kings up in Harlem. Some saw it as a betrayal. I saw it as simple math: more partners, more profit, fewer pointless wars. And when the money started flowing, even my loudest critics found it easier to shut their mouths. Enemies in the shadows, of course, every alliance makes an enemy somewhere else. Guys like Joe Adonis and Frank Costello were solid, but others, they smiled at the table and sharpened knives under it. One in particular, Vito Genovese, played the long game. Publicly he backed me. Privately, I could feel him circling. Men like Vito don't fight head-on. They wait for cracks to appear, then slip in like water and split the stone wide open. The art of diplomacy. If there's one thing the commission taught me, it's that you don't have to win every fight, you just have to make sure the other guy doesn't either. A perfect example was an incident with Dutch Schultz. Dutch was unpredictable, brilliant at making money, terrible at keeping his temper. He wanted to take out Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor who was making headlines putting gangsters behind bars. Now, Dewey was a problem for all of us, but killing him? That would have been like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. Every cop in the country would have come down on us. So I told Dutch no. Not in front of the commission, of course. I didn't embarrass a man publicly unless I wanted him gone. But in private, I made it clear this wasn't happening. Dutch didn't like it. He pushed. And when he pushed too far, the commission decided to solve the Dutch Schultz problem permanently. That's diplomacy in our world, smiling while you guide the knife. Keeping friends close with Meyer, there was never a question of loyalty. He didn't want my chair, he wanted the business to run smooth. Bugsy was trickier, he was fearless, but sometimes too fearless. He had a habit of making enemies faster than we could turn them into friends. But friends like these weren't just useful, they were insurance. When you're running an empire, you need people who'll tell you the truth even when it's ugly. And you need them close enough that no one else can turn them. Respect and fear. The balance was simple. My allies respected me because I respected them. My enemies feared me because I gave them reason to. I didn't go looking for fights, but I didn't shy away from them either. And when I had to end one, I ended it in a way that made the next man think twice. In this business, you can't be just liked or just feared, you need both, and you need to know when to turn one into the other. Looking back, those years were the sweet spot. The empire was strong, the money was flowing, and the commission kept the peace. But peace in our world is like a glass table, looks solid, but one wrong move and it's in 1,000 pieces. And I could feel the cracks forming. Power's not about how much you take, it's about how long you keep it. By the mid-1930s, I wasn't just another name in the papers, I was the name. The Luciano family controlled gambling, bootlegging, labor rackets, and more union contracts than most politicians could count. I didn't just run a crew, I ran an industry. And the city? It ran better with me in charge. We had our fingers in everything: nightclubs, docks, hotels, construction sites. If it made money, I had a piece of it. And it didn't matter if it was uptown jazz clubs or the produce markets down by the piers. Every dollar flowed somewhere into my books, or at least the version of the books Meyer let people see. Luxury is a tool. When people talk about power, they like to picture the suits, the cigars, the limousines. Those things aren't just for show, they're signals. I'd walk into the Waldorf Astoria's lobby like I owned it. The marble floors echoed under my shoes, the air smelled of polished wood and money, and the men behind the front desk always greeted me like I was the mayor. I wasn't flaunting wealth for the sake of it, I was teaching people what to expect when they dealt with Lucky Luciano. The truth? In our business, perception is leverage. Look like you're untouchable, and fewer people try to touch you. Union power. One of my biggest plays was the unions. Dock workers, truck drivers, garment workers, if they moved goods in or out of New York, they were part of my network. We didn't just skim dues, we controlled schedules, strikes, deliveries. That gave me something more valuable than money, leverage over legitimate businesses. When a company played ball, their shipments arrived on time. When they didn't, well, things happened. Meyer used to joke that we could shut down half of Manhattan with one phone call. He wasn't wrong. International reach. It wasn't enough to own the city. I started looking outward, Cuba, Florida, even Europe. The Havana casinos were just getting started, and I saw them for what they were, a gold mine with ocean views. Bugsy loved it down there, the music, the gambling, the women. Meyer saw the numbers. And me? I saw a future where New York was just the headquarters, not the whole empire. Respect from the top. Here's the funny part, while the cops and newspapers called me public enemy number one, there were politicians and businessmen who treated me like an equal. Some would come to me quietly, asking for favors, a union problem, a rival business making trouble, a shipment stuck at the docks. I solved problems, and I never forgot who owed me afterward. In politics, that's called influence. In my world, it's called insurance. The price of the throne. But here's the thing no one tells you about sitting at the top, it's never comfortable. The view's great, but you're always watching the stairs. Vito Genovese was still circling, biding his time. Other bosses nodded in meetings but made side deals behind closed doors. And the law? The law was watching closer than ever. I started noticing tails on my car more often. Wiretaps were becoming a thing. And Thomas E. Dewey, the so-called gangbuster, had made a career out of putting guys like me in front of a judge. Paranoia or preparation. Some nights, I'd lie in bed at the Waldorf, looking out over the city lights, and I'd wonder which came first, paranoia or survival instinct. Was I being careful, or was I starting to see threats in every shadow? I doubled my security, kept meetings short, and never took the same route twice. Even trusted friends were kept at arm's length. That's the tax you pay for power. Everyone's a suspect until proven otherwise. The calm before the storm. From the outside, it looked like I was untouchable. The clubs were packed, the money flowed, the commission meetings stayed civil. But I could feel it, the tension tightening, the same way the air feels before a summer storm. I'd been in this life long enough to know storms don't blow over on their own. Somebody brings them. And sooner or later, somebody was going to bring one straight to my door. Looking back, those were the last years I could still walk into a room and know I controlled the whole game. The empire was at its height, but so was the danger. And when danger starts climbing, it's only a matter of time before it takes the throne for itself. A courtroom ain't so different from the streets, you just trade bullets for lies. By 1936, I'd gotten used to the headlines, Luciano linked to labor rackets. Gangs are seen in Havana. Lucky's empire growing. But when I opened the paper that spring and saw Thomas E. Dewey's face staring back at me under the words "Prosecutor vows to take down Luciano," I knew the game had changed. Dewey wasn't like the other lawmen. Most of them wanted a payoff, a handshake, maybe a quiet favor to make a problem disappear. Dewey wanted scalps. And mine? Well, that was the crown jewel. The case they built wasn't about gambling or bootlegging. They went after something uglier in the public's eye: compulsory prostitution. Dewey claimed I was running an organized ring, controlling the vice trade in the city from top to bottom. Was it true? I'll tell you the same thing I told the papers: no, it wasn't. But in our world, truth has less to do with facts than with who tells the better story. And Dewey? He was a hell of a storyteller. The arrest, they took me in like they wanted a parade out of it. Detectives, flashbulbs, reporters shouting questions I didn't answer. I wore my best suit, smiled for the cameras. The trick in moments like that is to look like you're still the man in charge even if your wrists are in steel. One reporter asked if I thought I'd beat the charges. Let's just say I told him I've never lost a hand I wanted to win. The courtroom as a battlefield. The trial became front-page news from day one. The prosecution paraded witness after witness: working girls, madams, middlemen, all claiming they were part of some grand operation I supposedly ran. Some were lying to save themselves. Some were telling half-truths wrapped in enough drama to keep the jury leaning forward. My lawyers fought back hard, tearing at inconsistencies, pointing out gaps. But Dewey had built his case like a fortress, layer on layer, until even the cracks were covered. Public perception and the court of public opinion: I was already guilty. The papers painted me as the man who owned the city's shadows. Even people who didn't believe the charges figured it didn't matter. If I hadn't done this, I'd done something else just as bad. That's the thing about reputation: it keeps you alive in the streets, and it buries you in a courtroom. Moments of defiance. One afternoon during cross-examination, Dewey leaned in, trying to rattle me. You've lived off the suffering of others your entire life, haven't you? I smiled slow. I've lived off what the city gives me, Mr. Dewey. Maybe you just don't like what it gives you. The jury shifted in their seats. A few even smiled. But it wasn't enough. In court, charm's just another kind of smoke. And Dewey was bringing the fire. The verdict: after weeks of testimony, arguments, and endless days under the glare of the press, the jury came back, guilty on 62 counts. The judge didn't waste breath. He gave me 30 to 50 years. They say the room went quiet when the sentence dropped. I didn't hear it that way. I heard the scribble of reporters' pens, the shuffling of feet, the low murmur of people trying to make sense of it. Me? I buttoned my jacket, stood up, and walked out flanked by 2 deputies. If you're going to lose, you lose standing tall. The realization that ride to prison was different from the ride in the back of that black sedan years before. Back then, I didn't know if I'd live to see another sunrise. Now I knew I'd see them, but through bars. And still, I wasn't finished. You can lock a man's body away, but if you don't lock his mind, you haven't beaten him. Looking back, the trial was more than just the beginning of my prison sentence. It was the first open crack in the empire I'd built. Dewey had taken my freedom, but I still had my influence. And influence in our world can be smuggled through any set of bars. You can lock the body, but the empire? That's harder. Prison has its own smell, a mix of steel, sweat, and hopelessness. The first night they shut that cell door on me, I sat on the edge of the cot and listened to it: the echo of footsteps, the clang of metal, the low hum of men trying to sound tougher than they felt. A lot of guys come in thinking it's the end of the world. Me? I knew better. Out there, I had an empire. In here, I had time. Time to think, time to plan, and most importantly, time to keep my fingers in the game. Making the right friends in prison: respect works the same way it does on the street: you earn it fast or you lose it forever. I didn't come in throwing my weight around, but I didn't bow my head either. It didn't take long before the guards figured out who I was. Some treated me like any other inmate, others, they made sure I got certain privileges: a little extra food, a better work assignment. Those things aren't luck, they're investments. The other inmates? Some wanted to test me, see if the lucky name meant anything behind bars. The first man who tried didn't walk so well for a week after. After that, I didn't have to prove much. Running the business, I wasn't out there on the streets, but my crew was. Meyer kept the books in order. Vito Genovese, for all my mistrust, handled some day-to-day muscle. Bugsy Siegel made sure our interests stayed protected. Messages went out through visitors, through letters written in code, sometimes through guards who were smart enough to see the value in carrying a word for me. Deals still got made. Shipments still moved. The commission still met, and when my voice wasn't in the room, someone was there speaking it for me. The cell as an office, the cot was my chair, the little metal desk my boardroom table. I'd sit there at night going over mental ledgers, weighing which territories to hold tight and which to let go for now. Some nights, I'd look out through the bars at the moon and think about the Waldorf Astoria suite I'd left behind. But I didn't let nostalgia slow me down. Nostalgia's a weight in this life, it keeps you looking back when you should be looking forward. Respect in the yard was the real test. That's where reputations were made or broken. I walked it like I owned it, not with swagger, but with purpose. I'd nod to the right men, ignore the ones who needed ignoring, and keep conversations short unless I had something worth saying. It wasn't long before men came to me with their own prison problems, debts, protection, deals gone wrong. I handled them the same way I handled street business, quick, clean, no loose ends. The mental game prison strips some men down until they're just shells. I made sure it sharpened me instead. I read books on business, history, strategy. If I was going to be here, I'd use the time to think bigger. The more I studied, the more I realized something: the empire I'd built wasn't invincible, but it could survive me. That was the key. If it could survive me being in here, it could survive anything. Small luxuries, big statements. It might sound strange, but in prison, a good cup of coffee can be more powerful than a knife. I made sure I had mine every morning. It sent a message to the guards, to the inmates, that I still lived on my own terms. I didn't need a crown to be king. I just needed control. And control doesn't depend on where you are, it depends on who's willing to follow your word. The quiet confidence years passed. Dewey had his trophy. The papers wrote their headlines. But out there, the machine kept turning. Every time a piece of money made it from a bet, a shipment, a contract, some of it still traced back to me. I never fooled myself into thinking I'd be here forever. Every lock has a key, even if you have to make one yourself. And until the day came to walk out, I'd sit in this little metal office, keep the business running, and make sure the name Lucky Luciano stayed exactly what it had always been, a name you said with respect, or not at all. Funny thing, sometimes Uncle Sam needs a gangster more than a priest. It was 1942, and the world was on fire. Every headline was about the war, troop movements, bombings overseas, rationing at home. But behind the patriotic speeches and war bonds, the docks of New York were a different kind of battlefield. German submarines were hunting supply ships off the East Coast. Cargo was vanishing before it even left the piers. Rumors of sabotage whispered through the waterfront. And in a war where every crate of ammunition counted, those whispers got loud enough to reach Washington. That's when they came knocking on my cell door. The offer, it wasn't the warden who came to see me. It was men in dark suits, the kind whose names you didn't get unless they wanted you to have them. They sat across from me in the prison visiting room, eyes sharp, voices low. "Mr. Luciano," one of them said, "we understand you have influence over certain elements on the docks." I leaned back, let the silence stretch. "Influence is a funny word," I said. "But go on." They explained it plain enough: the U.S. Navy needed the docks secure. No theft. No sabotage. No delays. And the men who could make that happen weren't wearing uniforms, they were wearing the kind of suits you didn't buy in department stores. My suits. My men. Negotiation in chains in the street, every deal has a price. In prison, that price is freedom. I told them I'd cooperate on one condition: they'd have to talk to the governor about my sentence. They didn't say yes, and they didn't say no. But they kept coming back, week after week, with updates, with questions, with quiet requests passed through channels so deep you'd get the bends if you tried to follow them. I gave orders through trusted men, Meyer on the outside, a few dock bosses I'd known for years. The thefts stopped. The sabotage stopped. Ships left the harbor on time. And all the while, I sat in my cell, drinking coffee, playing cards, and waiting for the other half of the deal. The Navy's secret weapon, you won't read it in the history books, not the way it happened, but the Navy was in my debt. They called it Operation Underworld, like it was some tidy little file in a cabinet. In reality, it was me making sure no one so much as scratched a crate without my say-so. It wasn't just about keeping the Germans out. It was about showing that even in a war, the city's heartbeat ran through men like me. The release by 1945, the war in Europe was winding down. The governor of New York, Thomas Dewey himself, the same man who'd put me away, signed the papers. They called it commutation for wartime services. I called it business. They didn't hand me my old life back, though. The deal came with strings. I was a free man, but not in America for long. Deportation was waiting. Walking out the day I walked out of prison, the air felt different, like it had weight again. Reporters were waiting, shouting questions about the war, about the docks, about whether I'd go back to the rackets. I just smiled, straightened my tie. I'd done my service, I said. Now I'm just looking forward to some fresh air. But fresh air has a price, and mine came with a one-way ticket. The lesson that whole episode taught me something I already suspected: legitimacy is just a matter of timing. In one decade, they'll throw you in prison for running the docks. In the next, they'll shake your hand and thank you for it if it suits their needs. And in my line of work, knowing when it suits them? That's how you win. They sent me home to a country I barely knew. Freedom came with an ocean between me and everything I'd built. The day they put me on the ship, the skyline of New York faded into the mist, and I realized something: when you leave a city like that, it doesn't stop moving. It just stops moving for you. Italy was supposed to be home. I spoke the language. I knew the food, the smells, the music in the streets. But I'd left here as a boy, and the man I'd become belonged to another place entirely. Arrival in Naples greeted me with the smell of the sea and the sound of vendors calling out in the markets. It was beautiful, sure, but it wasn't mine. No sidewalks I'd fought for. No docks I controlled. No faces I'd built my life around. They put me under watch right away, local police keeping tabs, foreign agents whispering my name in bars. I wasn't back on the streets for a week before I knew I'd never be able to operate here the way I had in New York. A king without a throne. People still came to see me, some out of respect, some out of curiosity, some hoping the legend of Lucky Luciano could solve their little problems. And I'd listen, offer advice, sometimes even make a call to someone who still owed me a favor across the ocean. But it wasn't the same. In America, I could move pieces on the board and watch the game change. Here, I was just talking about the game from the sidelines. The Havana interlude, there were trips, short, quiet ones, to Havana. The casinos there were blossoming, and Meyer made sure I still had a seat at the table, at least in spirit. Those trips were a taste of the old days: money flowing, people laughing, the hum of deals being made in backrooms. But each time I flew back to Italy, the taste faded faster. Looking back across the water nights in Naples, I'd sit on the balcony of my apartment looking out at the dark sea. Somewhere beyond that horizon was New York, still alive, still making and breaking men. The funny thing about exile is you start to realize how much of your identity is tied to the ground you stand on. Take away the streets I knew, the people I trusted, and I was still Lucky Luciano, but in name more than in reach. The quiet acceptance over time, I made peace with it. I still had influence. I still had money. And I still had my name whispered in clubs, spoken with respect in meetings I wasn't even in. But I also had something I'd never had before: space. Space to think about the choices, the roads taken, the bodies left behind. I won't say I regretted it, but I won't say I didn't either. Because when you're far enough from the noise, you start to hear the echoes. Every king's got his last night. Mine came with champagne and a heart that just quit. By the 1960s, I'd lived 3 lives in one body: street kid, kingpin, exile. Naples was my home on paper, but I never stopped being a man of New York in my bones. The city's rhythm still played in my head, even as the real thing was half a world away. I kept my routines: coffee in the morning, a walk through the market, an hour on the balcony to watch the harbor. People still came to see me: old friends, young men chasing advice, a few filmmakers wanting to hear the real story. I never told them everything. Some truths you keep to yourself. Havana fading, the trips to Havana became fewer. The casinos I'd once dreamed of running forever started to fall under different hands. The charm of those warm nights by the roulette wheel faded into memories, still sharp, but untouchable. And I felt it in my bones: the game was moving on without me. That's how it always works. No matter how big you get, the world finds a way to keep spinning. The final meeting in January 1962, I had a meeting in Naples with Martin Gosh, a producer who wanted to make a film about my life. We met in the airport lounge, not some dark back room or gilded casino, just a quiet corner with coffee cups and a stack of papers. We talked for hours. He wanted drama. I wanted truth, or at least my version of it. I told him stories about the Lower East Side, about Meyer, Bugsy, the Commission. I left out the parts that didn't need telling. When the meeting wrapped, we shook hands. I lit a cigarette. My heart gave a strange flutter. I brushed it off: just fatigue, I thought. But collapse. I stepped outside into the cool air by the curb. The taxi was waiting. I took one last drag of my cigarette, exhaled, and felt my chest tighten, not like a punch, but like the air itself had turned against me. I remember my hand going to the side of the car for balance. Someone shouted my name. And then the world tilted. They tell me I was gone before I hit the ground. Heart attack. Quick, clean, like a final favor from a life that rarely dealt in mercy. The funeral, they buried me in Naples, but mourners came from every corner of the life I'd lived: old Sicilian faces, American associates, men who swore they'd never work with me but had done so anyway when the money was right. The papers called me the last great American gangster, the father of modern organized crime, a criminal genius. I read none of it, of course. But I imagine Meyer smiled at a few of those headlines. The final reflection: if there's a lesson in my story, it's this: power is never permanent. You can be feared, respected, loved, or hated, but in the end, the clock still runs out. I played my hands the way they were dealt. Sometimes I won big. Sometimes I lost everything but my name. But I never let anyone else shuffle my deck. And maybe that's why even now, long after the last card hit the table, the name Lucky Luciano still means something. Not because I was lucky, but because I made my own luck, and I made it last as long as I could. That's the end of the story, kid. The river keeps flowing, the city keeps moving, and the game, well, the game never stops. It just changes players.